Hello everyone and welcome to the third lesson of the Web Development Foundations Bootcamp. In this one, you'll be getting introduced into CSS fundamentals. Now, CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, which is simply a way for you to style your HTML elements. In the previous week, you learned about HTML and you saw that HTML is the building block of web pages. With HTML, you get to lay out and structure your web page, while in CSS, you get to beautify your web apps by styling using colors and positioning elements. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. Now, not to worry about the complicated name, you get to see why cascading is used in the naming of this beautiful technology. In this lesson, we'll focus on the theory. This means we won't be building any complex layout. Rather, you get to understand the inner working of CSS and build foundational knowledge for you to be able to create complex designs. We'll start off with Introduction to CSS. You see how to link style sheets to your HTML web page. Then we'll learn about the box model because in web design, everything is a box. We'll explore CSS selectors and how to position elements, and you get to see how to combine CSS selectors using combinators, and you also learn about specificity and inheritance in CSS. Not to worry, all these are not that complicated. So, while this lesson focuses on the theory, in the next lesson, we'll dive in and get into some practicals. The target of this bootcamp is for you to be able to create any web application or design from the front-end mentor. You can head over to frontendmentor.io and get registered if you haven't. And I think you need a GitHub account for that, but you'll create that later on in this bootcamp. So, at the end of this week, you should be able to build any UI layout of the newbie category of the front-end mentor. While in future lessons, when we cover building layouts using Flexbox and CSS Grid, you'll get to be able to build out any of the junior level designs. To follow along, I want you to install the Pesticide for Chrome extension. Browser extensions, just like Visual Studio Code extensions, simply lets you add additional features that your browser don't have. So the Pesticide for Chrome is a simple extension that lets you see the box styling or the box layout of your HTML elements. You can do this using Chrome DevTools, but Pesticide extension helps us better. And not to worry, we'll also be diving into Chrome DevTools to monitor and inspect elements. So go ahead and install this if you haven't, then let's dive in. For this lesson, I create an index.html file just like we've always done, and I set the title to CSS Fundamentals. And we also got this running on live server and you have it in the browser. Now it's time to get styling with CSS. There are different ways you can add styles into your HTML document. One way is by using the inline style feature. So for example, you can actually style the body of the web page. And remember, the body is the visual part you can see in the browser over here. So I could simply go over here and add the style attributes and set the background color property to blue. When I save my work, you can see the background of the web page is set to blue. As simple as that. You can also add additional properties. For instance, I can set the color to green, which is going to set the text color to green. But right now we have no text inside the body tag. And you can see the color of the text is set to green. So we can go on and add different inline style for the HTML elements. But if you do this, it will make your HTML file very complicated to read. So there's a programming approach called separation of concerns. Instead of having your styles in line with your HTML elements, it is best to separate it using the separations of concerns principle. So the HTML file will focus on the structure, then you delegate a separate file for your CSS styling to focus on the styling of the HTML web page. And that is where style sheets comes into place. So I'll undo this and save my work. Then I head over to the file directory and create a new file called style.css. You can actually give it any name. You're not bound to using a specific name like index.html, which shows the root web page. But for styling, you can give it style.css or stylesheet.css or main.css, whichever one suits your use case. All right, so in this file, we declare the styling. So for this, I could declare the styling for the body and set the background color to blue. Then I save my work. Right now, This is called a CSS selector because over here you're selecting the body element, and if you look at your index.html file, it is actually referring to this body element. I'll break down what is going on right now, but if you save our work, you can see if you reload the browser, nothing changes. And this is the time to link the style sheet file to the index.html file, and you do this using the link element. Remember I told you about the head section, and we can always hover over it to see what it does. So the head element represents a collection of metadata for the document, and metadata simply means extra information or configuration information. So you already know how this works, but now I need to introduce you to another child of the head element, which is the link element. So I just type in link and I press enter for the IMET abbreviation. We have the rel and the href attributes. The rel attribute simply stands for the relationship of this particular type of link. So what is the relationship of this link to our HTML page? The relationship is that this link is going to be a style sheet, while the href is going to point to where this file is located. In this case, the file is located in our file system. So I just hit the / and type in style.css, then save my work, and instantly the web page is updated. If I head back to the style.css file, you can see over here we targeted the body element and we gave it a property and also a value. This body you see over here is called a CSS selector. In this case, it is an element selector because it selects the body element. Now you can give multiple properties to selectors. For instance, we can also set the color to green just like we did before, and we save our work. And instantly you see that every text inside the body element is set to green. This is CSS selector for you. I'll go ahead and comment this by selecting and holding down the command and / key, and this adds the CSS comment. If you notice, the CSS comment is quite different from the HTML comments like you learned in earlier lessons. This is how comments work in CSS. So if I save this, it automatically excludes this from the browser's interpretation. Now, I could go ahead and add something else like a paragraph. I can head over to the style.css and give the paragraph some styling. And instantly, you can see the paragraph has a background color of yellow. Now, what if I want to add another paragraph to our documents like so? Then I save my work, and you can see over here, the second paragraph has the background color of yellow. Now, I want you to think about this. If styling elements is the only way to use CSS for HTML documents, you could encounter some challenges because, as you can see, the element selector selects all elements of that type in your web page. And that is why these two paragraphs have the background of yellow. To solve this, we use something called the class selector. So instead of targeting the element, we could give the paragraph a specific class, like so. So right now, we add the class attribute to the paragraph element and set it to intro. Instead of targeting P in the CSS file, we'll be targeting intro in the CSS file. So let's head over to the CSS file and declare the class selector like so. So you can see that the intro class only targets any elements that it is assigned to. In this case, the intro class is only assigned to the first paragraph element. So any style declared inside the intro class would be affecting only elements that have that class, while the element selector would be targeting all paragraphs. I'll comment out the paragraph element tag, then let me separate this. As you can see, since we've removed the paragraph elements selector styling, the second paragraph has no background color. Most times for your designs, you'll be using class selectors to style your web pages. Now, before we move on, there's another selector I want to mention, which is the ID selector. For example, classes can be applied to multiple elements. So for this, I could apply the class intro for the second paragraph and save my work. And you can see it is applied to the second paragraph. But we have another one called the ID selector. So if I add the ID like so and say heading, then I head over to, you can see the style is applied. But there's a downside to using ID selector because in web pages, IDs uniquely identify elements on the web page. So if I hover over this attribute, you can see it defines a unique identifier which must be unique in the whole document. Its purpose is to identify elements when linking and so on and so forth. You can also see that it can be used to identify elements when using CSS. But now comes the downside. If I give the H1 element an ID of heading, what if down the line in our web page we want to have some other heading with the same styling? As you can see, it renders correctly and it renders fine. And you might say, but you just told us that two elements can't have the same ID on a web page. Well, you don't have an error because HTML is not a programming language, so this whole source file is not compiled. Rather, it is interpreted by the browser, and the browser goes through this file and the syntax is correct, so you don't have any error in the console. If you check this, there's no red flag in the console. And also, Prettier doesn't complain down here because the syntax is also correct. Now you might be saying to yourself that, okay, if this works in the browser, then how is this not allowed? Well, when you start using something like JavaScript to select elements on your web page using the document object model, and let's say you want to select the ID with the heading, JavaScript will be confused as to which ID you should actually select. So if ever you want to use ID attributes to style, you should be super sure that it is only going to be that element on the web page. Not to worry, when we get to JavaScript, I'll show you this in action. I'll go ahead and remove this. But the main point to note is that down the line in this lesson and in future lessons, we'll be focusing on using classes to style elements. All right, let's continue. So far, we've been using color-specific values to style this element, but in CSS, you can make use of different color types. For instance, if you click on this, you can see something called RGB, but instead of using that, let me just change this to something called hexadecimal values. So I could use something like DF, DF, DF and save my work. And you can see the background color of the intro class changes to something like a light gray color or thereabout. So hexadecimal values provide you with different color variations to style using in CSS. And not to worry about these values, whenever you have a design handed over to you by the UI creator or the UI designer, they are going to provide you with these values so you don't have to think about this. Now, you can see the beauty about using classes. Once I change the background color of the intro class, every class or every element that has that class is instantly changed on the web page. So with this, you can be able to target multiple elements in your HTML page. And one thing to note right now is that if you were very observant, you'd notice the pound sign before this and also the dot operator before this, or the dot sign. Now, for ID selectors, you precede it with a pound symbol, while for class selectors, you precede it with a dot symbol. So that is how you differentiate between ID selectors and also class selectors. While for element selectors, you don't have any character preceding it. Rather, you just have the element name directly. In this case, you have the body and the paragraph tag. So that is for element selectors, ID, and also class selectors. I talked about hexadecimal color values. Let me show you another type, which is RGBA. So instead of having this pound, DF, 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 I'm going to use something called RGBA. So as you can see, RGBA stands for red, green, blue, and alpha. And alpha simply controls the opacity. So if I do something like 25500, then the alpha 0.5. So this is going to give me a red color with an opacity of 50%. So how do I know this is a red color? Let me put this RGBA to 1 and you can see. So RGBA, so R stands for the red channel, green channel, blue channel. So if the red channel is set to 255, which is the maximum value, and the green and the blue channel is set to 0, this means that this is a red color. So quick question, if I change this from 0, if I change the R to 0, the red to 0, and I change the green to 255, what is going to be the color? You guessed it right, green. So I'll undo this and give this an opacity of 0.5, which is half full, and 1, which means give me the full length of the color. So I'll undo this and back to our previous color. We can also set the font color if we want, and you set this using the color property. So I can set the color to something like DE. Let's see what that is. Oops. DE gives you the similar color with the background color. So let me see. Let me use the color picker. So if you hover over the color over here, you can actually set the color to something you want. So I could come here and set it to purple light color, and you can see the hexadecimal values are being updated. So once I'm done with this and I save my work, and you can see this is the text color or the font color, whichever one you want to call it. One last selector I'm going to cover right now before we head over to other properties of CSS is pseudo selectors. So I can come over here and do something like this, and once I type the colon mark, you can see different types of pseudo selectors. So pseudo selectors kind of like add additional meanings to the current selectors you have. So I could come over here and say hover. So whenever I hover on any element with the intro class, I want the color, or let's say I want the background color to change to yellow. So I save my work and I come over here, and if I hover, you can see whenever I hover, the background color changes to yellow. So this is called a pseudo selector. So pseudo selectors simply are used to add additional meanings to your class. So in this case, whenever I hover on the intro class, it changes the background color to yellow. And you can see over here, we have this pointer set to this text pointer. We can actually change that to something else by changing the cursor property. We change the cursor property to what? You can see different types. You can change it to pointer and save the work. So whenever I hover over this, you can see the cursor change to a pointer. So this gives us the effect that we can actually click this. But remember, this is just a paragraph element and not a link element, so we can't actually click this. But this is just to let you know that we have this property. Like I earlier said in the intro of this lesson, I said that we're going to be covering the theory of CSS, which is cascading style sheets. And if you look at what we have today, we have all this. I've done the basic intro. We're going to cover box models soon. You've seen CSS selectors. So one thing I want to cover is, while this stuff is called cascading style sheets, and also specificity and inheritance. Now, the name cascading style sheets, when you talk about something being cascading, it's kind of like a waterfall, or you could say a top-down approach. So let me just show you what I mean right now. So if I declare this class as intro over here, and I come over here and have this class as intro over here, but this time around, I change the background color to, let's say, blue. I'm going to be using this for now because I don't want to be, I don't have this hexadecimal values all in my head. So I'm going to be using the generic colors for now. So we have this class intro over here, and we also have this class intro. They're identical. So which one do you think is going to get executed? Or which is it going to have this gray background color, or is it going to have this blue background color? Let's save our work, and instantly you can see that the latest declaration takes precedence over the earlier declaration. So in this case, our CSS file cascades. That means kind of like flows like a waterfall from top to bottom. So if you declare something earlier and you kind of like declare it later on, the latest declaration overrides the previous declaration. So this is how the name cascading style sheet comes about. Cascading, it cascades kind of like a waterfall from top to down. Now you might be asking, okay, why is this important? Well, this knowledge is important because sometimes so many or some CSS related issue comes from a declaration overriding a previous one, and you might not know where or maybe you might be expecting a specific style somewhere, not knowing that you have overridden it down the line. So the important points to note is that the order of declaration is very, very important in CSS. As you can see right now, this declaration overrides because this file is read from top to bottom. So when it sees here, okay, the background color of the intro class is gray, it comes again, it meets another selector and says, oh, the background color is now blue. So the browser is going to take this one over here. So that is just the cascading part. So you just have to take note of that. So when I save, it goes back to this. One other thing I want to cover is CSS inheritance, or I can even just talk about CSS specificity. So for instance now, if I uncomment this paragraph ID selector over here and I save my work, you can see over here, okay, let me just copy this and paste it after this intro. Before I save the work, I want to show you something. You can see the element that has this intro class is a paragraph over here. So if I go back here, and I just talked about while the CSS file cascades, that means the latest declaration takes precedence over this. So if I save this work, you can see over here the intro class has a background color of gray, and over here I'm kind of like saying all paragraph elements should have a background color of yellow, right? So let me save my work and you can see what happens. Now, from the previous explanation I gave, I told you that the latest declaration would override the previous one. And you can see over here now, the intro class has the background color of gray, while the paragraph element has the background color of yellow. And you can see here, this is a paragraph and it also has the intro class. So they are two CSS declaration fighting to style this and also fighting to style this. So which one is going to take precedence over the other? Well, when it comes to taking precedence between different types of selector, the more specific the selector is, the more important or the more precedence it will have over any other selector. Now, between the paragraph element and the intro class, which of them do you think takes more precedence, or which of them do you think is more specific? In this case, I would say the intro class is more specific simply because in your web page, you could have multiple paragraph elements. So for instance, now I could have another paragraph here and say another paragraph. So in our web page, we can have multiple paragraphs, but we can now be specific and say, okay, I want to target a particular paragraph and give it a class. For instance, let me put this analogy in a real world example. If a teacher walks into a class and says, students, all students are going to turn around and look at the teacher. But if the teacher goes into that specific class and says, Michael or John, it would only be Michael or John that will turn around and respond to the teacher. So does that make sense? So paragraph or elements kind of like is generic. It targets all the elements. But when you give an element a class, you are being more specific. Does that make sense? So over here, even though paragraph comes after the intro class, in CSS, the class selector takes more precedence over the element selector. So that is why this paragraph element selector does not affect this intro class. Now you might be saying to yourself, okay, in what scenario would I be using this? Well, just like we did here, we could come over here and say we want to style we want to have all our paragraphs have yellow color by default. Then you now want to specify which paragraph should have a different color by assigning a different class to it. So that is just one way you can be specific about your CSS. Now, let me show you something else, which is inheritance. For example, now I could come over here to this paragraph and use something like this. This element is nested inside this paragraph, and by default, we give all paragraphs to have a background color. So automatically, this element is going to inherit the background color of its parent, in this case, the paragraph tag. So I can come over here and do something like color should be, so the color should also be coral, and you can see automatically this emphasized element takes up the color of the parent element, which is the paragraph tag, and it has the same color as this. So this is called inheritance in CSS. So the child element can inherit properties of the parent element. But if, for instance, now I don't want to, or I want to have this element have a different styling, I can be more specific and say, okay, I could give it a class, or I could say, be more specific and say, so you can see over here now, I am more specific. I'm now saying this is a way of also like using, or this is a way of combining selectors, or you can call it combinators. So over here, I'm targeting the P, then the M. So this means that I'm targeting the emphasis. Okay, is this M? Let me check. What is this tag called? The M element, which is emphasized element. So over here, I'm targeting the emphasized element, which is inside the paragraph tag. So, or you can go the other way around and say, target the P, then go inside the P and target the emphasized element. And you can see over here, the P, then the emphasized element is inside it. So in here, I am being more specific to say that, okay, I want this emphasized element to have the color of blue. But what if, for instance, now we have the emphasized element declared somewhere like so, and we say the color should be red. So you can see over here now, if I comment this out, all emphasized elements is going to be red. But if I come over here and I be more specific and says, I want, okay, no, let me put some other emphasized text somewhere. So you can see over here from the style, all emphasized elements should be red. Now, if you want to target this specific one inside the paragraph, you can now come and be more specific and say something like, I want the emphasized text inside the paragraph to be blue. So if I save my work, you can see this one over here is blue and all other emphasized text are red. Now, I know we are diving, or we are just being so theoretical without like a real world practical and stuff like that. But not to worry. The reason I'm covering this is when I get to the next lesson where we'll be diving into how to apply all this in a design, I wouldn't be going step by step, and you should also, or you would also have a knowledge of how all this actually works. This is not just limited to, this combination is not just limited to stuffs like this. You can actually combine more. So for instance, if we have a deeply nested structure, like we have intro, we have another class inside it, heading, and we also have another class inside its main, we can keep on combining different CSS like this and so on and so forth. So this was a way we did it in the earlier days, but later on there's something called the BEM approach, which is block element modifier. I think I'll be talking about that in the next lesson, which is going to help you prevent this type of nesting. And you can see from the CSS selector over here, if I hover, you can see this is how it's going to look. We have the intro, then inside we have the heading, and inside we have the main class. So this is the actual structure, but I'll be showing you a better approach to do this. But the reason I'm just showing you is that you can actually be specific about what you actually target. So we've covered specificity and inheritance, and also combining CSS selectors. All right, before we talk about the box model, let's talk about styling text and common attributes. Right now, we can see that our text is kind of like boring. So in CSS, we can actually have our own fonts. We can actually add our own custom fonts because as you can see over here, this font is kind of like boring. So Google Fonts provides us with lots of different fonts we can use for our web application. And to get here, you just head over to fonts.google.com and you get to see different types of fonts you can use in your web apps. But there are common ones you can actually select from, or whichever design handed over to you by the UI UX folks would also include a font for you to use. But for this one, I'll be using Montserrat. Montserrat. We have Open Sans and stuffs like that. So Montserrat, this is how the font looks like. And you can see different weights. So the font weight is kind of like how bold the font would be. So you can see thin 100 or simply 100 gives you a very, very thin font. And if you keep scrolling down, you can see regular. You can also see semi-bold, which is 600 and so on and so forth. But what you just have to do after searching for the font is to get the font, and you can see it's added to our cart over here. Then I'll click on Get Embed Code. And this is the code we get to copy. So over here, you can see the instruction. Everything is straightforward. It says here, embed code in the head of your HTML. So this is the code we're going to embed in the head section of our HTML. So let me just copy that and come over to our index.html. Then I'll put this before our CSS style sheet. So the order at which you import or you link files is also important. So since the CSS file, which is this, is going to be using this font, I'm going to put it above this. So I'm going to copy and paste and save. And this is the code I pasted over here. You don't need to know about all these things because these are also links, just like a style sheet. This is also kind of like a style sheet over here. This is a style sheet of the font family. And you can see over here, it has the URL. This one over here is a local file, style.css. You can see it over here. While the font itself is coming from fonts.googleapis.com and so on and so forth. And over here, you can see I'm selecting all the whole fonts from the thinnest to the most bold font. You can actually select a specific one, maybe like 100, 200, 400. If you select lesser font weights, in this case, I'm selecting the range of 100 to 900, which is about 10 different font weights. So the file size or the download size is going to be higher. But if you're very sure in your application, maybe the designer handed it over to you and said, I'm just going to be using the regular font and the extra bold font, you kind of like select it on Google Fonts here, and it's going to download a smaller bundle size for your font. But most of the times you don't need to worry about all these things because it's kind of like downloads the font once and it caches it so that the next time you're going to retrieve this font, it's going to be faster. So this is not something to worry about at this stage of your development journey. So this is the font, this is the code we copied and pasted here. So this gives us access to use that font file. Now you might be asking, okay, I just copied this and I saved my work, I refreshed, it's not updated in my browser, we still have this boring font. Well, not to worry because Google Font provides you with a code you can also add. So this is the code to add. I'm just going to only going to copy the font family property. Then I head over to my style.css. In this case, I'm going to select the body. You can also select the body, or you can also select the HTML, whichever one you want. But in this case, I'm just going to remove all this. I can comment it out, then just add this. So over here, I'm saying the font family should be what? Let me save my work. And instantly, you can see this font is more beautiful than the default one. Now, the font family is what? Montserrat. Then what is now the second stuff, sans serif? Well, this is a fallback font. So for instance, if we open this page and we are not connected to the internet to download this style sheet for the fonts, it's going to fall back to sans serif, which is kind of like installed in every computer. So there are different scenarios whereby this one won't load up. So the first one is, for instance, if the internet is down, or probably if, for instance, you misspelled this. So if I remove the A and I save my work, you can see it falls back to the sans serif font because there's no font on the internet that has the spelling. So it falls back to the sans serif font, which is similar to the Montserrat font. I'm not going to be diving into what a sans serif or a serif font is. That will be a more advanced topic at this stage. So I save my work and we have the Montserrat font, and our web page is looking a little bit better than the previous one. Another thing to do would be font sizes or just fonts family. So for instance, now I could say you've already learned about font color, which is just the color property. So this is the property and this is the value. Now the next thing we're going to be talking about is another type of selector. As you can see, if you watch the previous lesson, you can see that the HTML comes with some default styling, and I can show you that. So if I head over to the browser and I right click on the H1 and I select inspect, can you see some CSS styling that comes with this? This heading is the one we declared over here because this has the ID of heading over here. If you look at the HTML, this is the one we declared. So we can also toggle on and off inside our DevTools. And I want you to look at this one. You can see the H1 has some default styling. We did not actually style this. If you can look at this, we have this style coming from style.css. But this one over here is user agent style sheets. So the user agent in this case is our browser. And which browser are we using? Google Chrome. So Google Chrome adds this for us. If you're using Mozilla Firefox, it might be slightly different. So you just have to take note of this. So for instance now, can I toggle this? Okay, I can't toggle this on and off, but I can reset it in our CSS style. You can see over here we have margins and you can see this stuff. So if I select, I'll click on this over here and just hover on this. I'm not going to click on it because if you click on it, it's going to just select it in the HTML. So I'm going to come over here, then hover over this. You can see there's some padding, there's some spacing it adds. If you look at the bottom and the top, you have this orange spacing over there. So the H1 elements and some other elements add this spacing for us. You can also see this paragraph also has spacing at the top and at the bottom over here. And there's a way that could set this to remove all this default styling. Because let's face it, we want to have control over the spacing and the styling of our user interfaces, because sometimes when the UI UX folks gives us the design, it comes with their own spacing and positioning. So to reset this default styling or to reset some of this default styling for all the elements so we can have control over them, we make use of the universal selector. So I'm going to be doing this at the topmost points. I'll name this. And you use this selector using the asterisk symbol. Then over here, I can say margin 0, padding 0. I'm going to be explaining what this margin and padding does. But right now, I want you to just know that all the whole spacing for elements are now removed. So you can see here we set the margin to 0 and the padding to 0. And this asterisk sign selects all the whole element. And if you hover over it, let's see what it says. Okay, so it selects the whole element and it removes the padding and margin. Like I said, I'll talk more about margin and padding shortly. But this now gives us control to add this margin and padding as much as we want. So if I once again right click on this hello world or the H1 and I select inspect and then I select it by clicking on this and I go over here. Can you see we don't have any space at the top, at the bottom? Also, same thing for the paragraphs. You don't have any space for the top and the bottom. With this, we get to give this spacing our own defined values, which gives us more control over the styling. So now, one other thing, or the next set of properties I'm going to be talking about is the text related properties. And before we head over, I can actually come over here and go to the heading and give the font size. Let's see, let's talk about the font size and give it a font size of 72 pixel. And you can see the font size is bigger. It's looking quite big. So I can just give it 52 pixel and we have the bigger font size. So we use the font size to control the size of the font. So for all paragraphs, I could come over here and say the font size should be, I don't know what the font size is currently now. Is it 16? Is this zoomed? Okay, this is zoomed. That's why it was looking bigger. Okay, so we can set the font size of the paragraphs to maybe like 14, and you can see they become smaller. If you give it a bigger value, they become bigger. But in this case, I think the default font size is 16 pixels. So if I give it a font size of 16 and I comment this out, it retains this font size. Now, there are different values. Other than pixels, we have REM and EM. So REM is kind of like relative to the default font size. So let me just show you what that means. I'm not going to be going deep into that right now. We'll be making use of REMs when we get to building layouts in CSS. But for now, I could say 2REM. Let's see what happens. So 2REM is going to equal to doubled, like I told you, the default font size in the browser is 16 pixels. So REM is kind of like relative pixels. So 2REM is going to be equals to 32 pixels. Let me just confirm that quickly. So you can see when we override the font style, you can see by default, like I told you, the font size for the paragraph in the browser is 16 pixel. But this time around, we overrode it by declaring as with a new font size property and set it to 2REM. And that is why you can see the strike through line over here, which means we're kind of like overriding the default font size. So 2REM simply means double the size of the default font size. So if you head over to the computed tab and go to font size, you can see 32 pixel, which means it translates to 16 multiplied by 2, which is equals to 32. Now, I don't want you to disturb yourself or worry about what this REM means at this point, but just know that this is a better approach, because if you had given this font size 16 pixel, this is going to be a fixed value. So if, for instance, the user changed the default font size, let's say the user was browsing on a mobile phone and changed his or her Android's font size to a bigger font size, 2REM is going to scale up to double of that font size. But if you are using a definite value like pixel, it is going to retain that original font size irrespective of the user's device font size. Like I said once again, there's no need to disturb or worry yourself about this at this point, since I'll be covering it down the line. So this sets it back to default font size. Now, one more thing I want to cover is, let me see, paragraph, and I use lorem 40. So this is the text we are currently working with right now. This one over here. Let me give it a class of description. I know this is a bit everywhere, but not to worry. When we get to the practicals, or when we get to building layouts, you get to see all this in a practical sense, and I won't get to repeat myself then. So let me see, we could set the text align property to center, and let's see what happens. You can see right now the text over here is aligned to the center. You can see by default they are aligned to the left. Let me make this bigger, and you can see this text is aligned to the center. This is a common styling feature that you can see on different web pages. For instance, you can see this text over here in this tab, this text is aligned to the center. If it was aligned to the left, this web will be pushed to the left. If it was aligned to the right, this web will be pushed to the right. So that is text align property. Then we can also do this thing. We can also say text align to the right. Let's see what happens. And you can see it is pushed to the right. If you come over here, it is pushed to the right. There are instances your user interface might want something like this. So you could simply apply it. The next property would be the line height, which is going to be the spacing or the distance between one line to the next line. So I could set the line height to, let me see, 2. Yeah, you can set it to 2 and it's kind of like increases the height. Let me see, 2 pixel. Can you set it to pixel? You see, you can set it to 2 pixel. You can set it to 2 rem. So that is line height. That is the spacing between, set it to 3, the spacing between each line. So you use that depending on your user interface design or depending on the design the UI guy or UI UX person gives to you. We also have word spacing. Word spacing. So you can see this is the spacing between each individual word. So there are some times that you might want to give some spacing in between each word. Let me see if I use 2. So you have to give it a value. And most of all these properties, when you head over to MDN or W3 schools, you get to see how to use them. So if I click on the MDN reference, for instance, it opens up the web page and you can see how to use that. So if I go to word spacing, MDN, so you can see the different values you can actually give to them. So the higher the value, the higher the spacing. So that is just word spacing for you. So 2 rem, more spacing, and so on and so forth. The next thing I want to cover is the box model. Let me remove this. If we head over to the browser and we activate pesticide, this might not be a good way to see this, but let me just head over to something like Google Fonts and I activate pesticide. I want you to look at this web page. Everything in the web page is kind of like represented as a box. You can see this text over here, the image over here, the menu bar by the left, and the entire user interface. You can see everything here is represented as a box. And the reason I could see this on my web page is because of the pesticide extension, which I installed earlier. So in CSS, there's something called the box model. And the box model is responsible for how elements are represented, whether via spacing or positioning or stuff like that. So the box model is simply used for layouts in HTML and CSS. With the box model, you get to kind of like represent every HTML element using a box. So for our design over here, you can see the box over here. You can see everything is kind of like packed together. But when we look at this Google Fonts website, you can see that each individual box has some spacing and kind of like distance between different HTML elements. And the box model simply comprises of different properties. So if you head over to W3 Schools and the box model page, you can see right now the content of whatever you see in a web page is contained inside here. Then the box model also has the padding, the border, and the margin. Now, the padding is the space between the content and the border, which is kind of like the edge of the container. So if we head over to somewhere like this box, for instance, you can see this is kind of like a padding because this is the content and this is the edge of the container. Then you also have the margin, which is kind of like the distance between a container and the next container or the outside world. So over here, this distance over here could be seen as the margin, but this could be a little bit confusing sometimes. So let me show you how this works with our example over here. So for the heading ID selector, which is this, I could give it a margin or a padding of, let me start with padding. I could give it a padding of 16 pixels. And instantly you can see the space over here. So if I give it a padding of 32 pixels, you can see it has more space. Now, we are not using rem for this. We mostly use the rem measurement for fonts related sizing and stuff like that. So we have the padding of 32 pixels. So you can see the pesticide shows us that this is the box, but this is not really descriptive, so we can turn off pesticide. Pesticide, I personally don't use it, but I just installed it so I could show you stuffs like this. But if I turn it off and I head over to, I just right click on this and select inspect, then I come on this place in the HTML file, or I can also do this and select this or hover over it. You can see over here, the box model is kind of like being displayed. So this is the content, and outside here you have the margin. Let me add one more property so I could explain this better. The next one to add is the margin, and I could add the margin of 32 pixels. Let me add the margin. And when I hover over here, can you see something? We have the content, the padding, which is the distance between or the spacing between the content and the edge of the box. Then we also have the margin. The margin is what? The spacing between the edge of the box or the border to the outside world. Now, we give this heading 1 a background color of green. So you can see over here, the margin is the outside, oops, let me remove this. The margin is the outside space. Can you see it? The margin is the outside space, and over here we've given it the margin of 32 pixel. So we have 32 pixel on the left, 32 pixel on the top, on the right, and also on the bottom side of our container or of the box. And one other way to see this or visualize this is you can scroll down to this, or let me see. Okay, computed. Okay, we can also come over here and you can see the box model. So instead of you going to find it in W3 Schools, you can simply come to Developer Tools. When you right click on, you can come over here, right click and do inspect, or right click on the element you want to open and automatically select it. Then you can come over to the Computed tab and it is going to show you what the box model representation is. So over here, we have the actual content, and which has the width of 682 and the height of 63.5 pixels, but I'll explain more on width and height shortly. But right now we have the what? The padding. Then after that, we have the border. In this case, can you see the dash, which means we don't currently have a border right now. Then outside this, we now have the margin of 32 pixel. And you can see this is how the spacing is being computed. Now, let's go ahead and add the border before I show you something. So I could say border of 5 pixel, solid, and the color should be, let me say black. And instantly, you can see we have the border. And if you look at the box model over here, we have the contents, which contains hello world. We have the padding, which is 32 pixel, the border of 5 pixel, and the margin of 32 pixel. So this simple thing you're seeing here is called the box model. Now, this is a simple example, but the thing to just note is that the box model is simply used to represent layouts in your web pages. A site like fonts.google.com, you can see there's spacing between each individual element. You can see over here that this is the padding, this is the margin, because it separates this box from this box. Now you can also see over here that this over here is kind of like the padding, because it gives a padding at the top and a padding at the bottom. Now the reason why this text is at the center is simply not because of the padding or something. Rather, it is at the center because of the text alignment was set to center, which is what I just covered with this one over here. So that is the basic example of what the box model simply looks like. When you're creating interfaces like this, I think we're going to be creating this one in the next, I'll decide. We're going to be creating something like this in the next lesson. And you can see over here, this stuff over here is the padding. Because I know you might be thinking, okay, why am I doing all these things and why don't I just dive straight up and just build something like this? So many times you see students online, whenever I go on YouTube or stuff, you check the comment section and they ask so many questions on CSS or HTML or React or Tailwind CSS tutorials. And they ask basic questions like, okay, my interface is not like correct, or they have issues with their interfaces not displaying properly. And the reason is simply because they don't have the foundational knowledge. Because if you understand how this whole stuff is structured, you would have an easier go when it comes to tackling interfaces like this. And for the next lesson, I'm going to be faster than how I'm currently going through this particular lesson. For this interface, you can see we have the padding over here. We also have the margin, which is the space from this box to the outside box. We also have the line height. You can see the line height, the distance from this line to this line to this line. Same thing for this. The line height is also different. And the text alignment, in this case, the text alignment is aligned to the left, to the left, to the left, while this one is aligned to the center. You can see all these basic stuff we are actually covering is going to be the building block to build any user interface. So if you understand this very well, building any of this interface would be a piece of cake, trust me. And we'll be covering some of these UI interfaces as we proceed. So now, there's one thing I want to quickly mention. Everything in this user interface is currently full width. So we can change the width of this to, let me see, the width of this heading to 300 pixel. And let's see what happens. 300 pixel. Okay. So this is 300 pixels. And this is the width. We can also set the height if we want to. Height equals to 100 pixel. Let me see what happens. It looks like nothing changed. Let me set the height to 50 pixel. And there's already an overflow right now. But let me set it to 100. And later on, you'll see how we tackle those type of stuffs. So now the width is 300 pixels and the height is 100 pixels. So let's head over to the box model once again to see what happens. We have a problem. And if we take a look at this, right now, what I actually want is that this entire box, the distance from this point to this point should be 300 pixel, and the distance from this point to this point should be 100 pixel. That means 100 pixel height, 300 pixel width, just like we have in our CSS declaration over here. But if you go over here to the box model, I want you to take a look at this. Right now, it does not set the entire box to 300 pixel and the height to 300 pixel. Instead, it sets only the content to a width of 300 pixel and a height of 100 pixel. And this is not what we want most of the times, because when I say I want this height, the width to be 300 pixel, visually, I mean that the width should start from here and end here, and the total width should be 300 pixel. But right now, the 300 pixel, if you hover over here, you can see it only selects the content, and this is not what we want. Rather, the actual width of this is what? 300 plus 32 plus 5 plus 32 plus 32 plus 5 plus 32. And remember, the 32 is for the padding, the border is 5, and the margin is actually 32. Now, for many beginners that don't understand this fundamental knowledge, you might be having issues in your layout probably when you switch to mobile device and it does not appear like you expect it to appear. And this is simply because they don't understand how the box model works. So you can see by default, it gives the total of the margin, the border, and the padding, and the actual content. Now, to override this behavior, you simply set the box sizing. So for this, I could set the box sizing to box sizing. So by default, I think it is content box, but I'll set the box sizing to what? Border box. So when I save this, you can see instantly that the width of this box is actually what? 300 pixel, and the height is also 100 pixel. Now, there was a mistake I made somewhere which I'm going to correct. Okay, let me uncomment this first and correct my explanation. So the actual width of this box, like I stated earlier, was not you don't have to add the margin, because remember what I told you, the margin is the space of the actual box to the outside world. So the actual width is actually 374 pixels, because I'm adding the 32 pixels of padding on the left and right, that is this, and also the border on the left and right, which is this and this. And the border is the black stuff you can see over here. So the actual width of this box is 374 pixels. You could also do the same addition for the height, which is going to be 100 plus 32 plus 32 plus 5 plus 5. Then you get that value. And I just stated that this might not be actually what you want, because you want, whenever you give a box a width, it should stay or fixed to that width. So if I change the box sizing to what? Border box. Now we have the actual size of this box. And if we right click on this and open up DevTools, we can now say that the width of the content is now 226 pixels. So this property of setting it to border box automatically recomputes the width of the content and divide it based on the padding and the border. So in this case, the browser automatically computes the new width of the content to be 226. Then it now adds the padding and the border. So if you add 226 plus 32 plus 32 plus 5 plus 5, let's do that now and see. And you can see 226 plus the padding on the left and the padding on the right, and the border on the left and the border on the right equals to 300 pixels. So with this, we now know that whenever we set the width of a container, of a content, of a text or anything, we know that the width is going to be the actual width and not the width of the content plus the padding and the border. So you don't always add the margin in this computation. Rather, you just add the padding, the content, and the border. Hope this makes sense. So now you can see that the text is bigger than the box it contains. So we can use the overflow property for that. So we can see overflow scroll. So right now, we can scroll inside this box. So this is a CSS property that does this. We can also change this to what? Overflow hidden, and you won't be able to scroll, but it's going to hide that content. So that is how that property actually works. So that is the basics of CSS in a nutshell. All this will be put into practice as we progress. Now, I know this was not super visually appealing like you expected, but this is the core foundations of how CSS actually work. Let me give a brief overview of what we've learned in this lesson. I mentioned that CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and the word cascading simply means it goes from top to bottom, kind of like a waterfall. To select elements in your web page, you make use of IDs, classes, or the elements. In this case, when you use IDs, even though I would not advise you use IDs, but whenever you use IDs or class selectors, you assign that element to the class, and over there in CSS, you set the properties that you want this class to have. And these stuffs are called selectors. So you have the ID selector, the class selector, the element selector, and also the universal selector. And one thing I forgot, or one thing I did not do correctly, was for this heading, instead of having this box sizing to border box, we can as well set it for all the whole elements in our HTML documents, and we can do this using this asterisk selector, which I told you is the universal selector. So over here, I could come over here and put box sizing. So with this, we don't always have to set this property for every element that wants to make use of this feature. So that is the universal selector, and you declare it using the asterisk symbol. So for the universal selector, we remove the margin and padding for all elements. If we comment this out, it means that all the whole paragraph, H1 and different elements in our web page would have some predefined margin in our browser. And the reason we remove this is for us to have control over these properties. So the next selector we talked about was the element selector, whereby you reference the actual HTML element. So you could reference paragraph, emphasis, H1, body, and so on and so forth. And for this, you just mention them and you put the corresponding properties in colored braces. We also talked about inheritance, whereby when we declared this paragraph and we said that all paragraphs should have a color of coral, we now came over here and said that if we did not specify a CSS selector for this or a CSS rule for this. And one thing I should mention is that this stuff over here, the combination of everything is called the CSS rule, or these are CSS rules. Do you get? And a CSS rule has a property and a value. So I talked about inheritance. For instance, if we have another paragraph, so you can see over here, we make use of the strong tag, and by default you can see it has the same color as the paragraph element because it is simply inside the paragraph element, so it inherits the properties of the parent element. So that is CSS inheritance. And you can see the reason why this is a little bit darker is because of the strong tag, which kind of like boldens the text. So automatically this element is what inherits the properties of its parents, in this case the paragraph. And I showed you that if you want to override the inheritance, you could be what? More specific. So in our CSS we made use of what? Combinators. So in this case I said target the emphasis element that is inside the paragraph and give it a color of blue. And that is why this one has the color of blue. So that is kind of like CSS specificity. So the more specific you are, the higher the precedence of your CSS rules and styling. Next, we talked about stuffs like line height and word spacing for paragraph elements and stuff like that, which kind of like adds the spacing between each line in your paragraph. So for instance, if I uncomment the line height, you can see we have more spacing. The same thing for word spacing. And I also talked about pseudo selectors. So for instance, we have intro, then hover. So the pseudo selectors are introduced using the colon sign. So when you have the class name dot intro, then you have colon, then hover. If we delete this, you can see different types of pseudo selectors. You can select after, you can select before, you can select first child. So for instance, if you have a list item, you can style the first child, you can style the first letter, and so on and so forth. So these are called like pseudo selectors, which kind of like add additional information. So for this intro, I said that any class with the intro, whenever I hover over it, the background color should be yellow and the cursor should be pointer. So that is going to be this. You can see over here, when I hover over this, the cursor changed to a pointer and the background is yellow. So this is the basic fundamentals of CSS. Then in the next lesson, we'll be heading over to Front-End Mentor and we'll pick one of this newbie challenge and build them up. And an important point to note is that I won't be going over the basics of HTML and CSS again. This will be hands-on and we'll be diving deep into some practicals to show you how this works real time. That's it for this one, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.